I'm a public health nutritionist. That means I have a good, solid science background, but also quite a lot of social science in my training. But I now work in the social and the policy aspects of food in a department of sociology. So am I a mixed up kid? No, I'm somebody who understands that when you study or research or indeed engage with food and nutrition, you need to have a multidisciplinary approach. And I've been very lucky to be able to have that. And I've worked in the global south and I've worked in the rich north, usually on poverty. So that's where I'm coming from. And what drives me is a desire to have a food system which is just and fair, and where people's access to food and their pleasure in food become as important as saving money on public health or economic value. Though, of course, both of those are pretty important too. There's been a huge amount of very exciting research which has been done in the last, 100 years or so really, about the components of food and the ways in which nutrients and other aspects of food contribute to individual health, both in deficiency diseases, the role in helping people avoid infection, and most critically, perhaps from government's perspective, is the role that the safety of food plays, that there are not toxins and contaminants and other pathogens and things that cause immediate harm in the food that people eat. Governments care about that because they don't want their populations getting suddenly sick or dying, and they particularly don't want their food system to be under economic jeopardy because it's been shown to be causing very severe ill health like that. There's a lot of very exciting research that goes on now about different nutrients and components of nutrients at the metabolic cellular level and the interactions between that and the human genome, for example. So some really kind of sexy stuff going on epigenetics and the connections between micronutrients and very small components of the food system, of food that you eat, and the ways in which your genetic makeup is expressed. And that doesn't just happen in the cell, in the fetus, it also happens throughout your life. People are beginning to understand much more detail about this relationship between particular syndromes, something like type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome or osteoarthritis, say, and the role that diet plays both in causing those but also in helping prevent them and helping people who have those conditions live with them better, even if not actually cure. That's not quite a word we hear so often. And what that means is that there are particular foods that are being manufactured, produced, engineered, that meet particular conditions that certain people have. And as I say, a lot of money is going into that and a lot of intellectual endeavour. It's real cutting-edge stuff. That isn't actually where I work, not because I'm not interested in that, but because I'm interested in the bigger picture and a perhaps slightly different model of food and health, but also because I want to ask questions about that kind of research, such as who gains, where's the gain coming, the economic gain and the personal gain. It's terrific, as I say, it's very intellectually and possibly economically and sort of politically exciting. But I also want to ask, well, actually, many of the people in the world who are developing diabetes, as an example, many of the people in the world who are obese are actually poorer people. And if you're really interested in malnutrition, which includes obesity quite often, people who are obese often have very poor micronutrient status in their bodies, then I wonder, a lot of those people are poorer. They don't have a lot of money. So are they going to be able to afford these kinds of foods because they're often more expensive? And also they're the people who, it's a generalisation, but they're often overlooked politically. Maybe they don't vote, maybe they're the wrong tribe, maybe they're the wrong part of the country. They don't have much say. There is also growing evidence from epidemiology and other kinds of science that actually it isn't just the nutritional components that link to health, but also how you eat, the patterns of foods that you put together, eating meals, if you like, what time you eat those meals, what stage of the day. Those all link to health too. And they also have a different effect at different stages of the life course. By and large, unless they're destitute, people choose the food they do because it tells you something about them. It's about their identity, who they belong to, who their family, friends, kins are. And food is also about hospitality and pleasure and celebration. So when a friend comes, you offer them a drink or something to eat. If a very important person comes to your village, comes to your street, what do? We have a celebratory meal. And so on. I don't need to spell it out further. So what food means to people is not just about avoiding disease. It's very much about commensality, is the sort of fancy word for it really, about pleasure, well-being and sharing. And for some people, if you ask that question, as I did a few years ago in the UK, in fact, talking to people who were getting more involved with local production, meeting local producers through community-supported agriculture or farmers' markets or box schemes or something like that. And these are not just in the UK, of course. What people said then was, well, to me, health is about the well-being of the local area and that we have a good economy that includes lots of people. Maybe we're not all rich, but we all have more than enough and we share what we have. So I think that's a really interesting finding, not just from research I've been involved in, but that other people have done as well. How much that sense of a local livelihood is important to people. Food can often be a means of bringing people together and building a local economy. And it's a kind of social glue, if you like. Perhaps not a very good metaphor for food, but not a bad one. But it also enables people to express a concern about their local physical and natural environment. They care about soil, they care about water, they care about animal welfare, and they also care about future generations. And so by being involved in food some way or another, even if it's only buying, preparing, cooking and eating it, people can express that much bigger sense of health, which matters very much. So already we've moved on from this rather scientific, reductionist, biomedical approach to food and health to this rather bigger picture. And just that, I think that also illustrates one of the things that a lot of the people who work on the sociology of health would often argue. The challenge, if you like, to the biomedical model of health, that by reducing it down to small components, reducing health and the body down to small components, we're missing that bigger picture. And we're missing what it is that enables people to feel good, to feel healthy, to feel their lives are worth living and they have a contribution to make. It also, of course, by making it difficult, making it overly scientific, making it too professionalised, we not only take power and knowledge away from people, we take away the economic power, the power to control who grows what, power over seeds, being able to exchange seeds, exchange recipes, know how food works. And that power increasingly in the biomedical and highly scientific model increasingly resides in distant transnational corporations who are not accountable to voters, not accountable to anyone but their shareholders. And of course, also you find that the link to biomedicine is not accidental. You find quite a lot of pharmaceutical companies, which are also food companies, and they control huge amounts of the food system. And they also control quite a lot of advertising, which comes along and says, oh, don't worry about fresh fruits and vegetables. They're very difficult to grow and they go off and you're not very good at cooking them. Why don't you buy this fancy stuff we've made, which has got all these special nutrients in, just good for you. So I'm a bit suspicious about all of this push to have everything highly scientific and highly medicalised. And I want a bit more openness in that system. I think what is now becoming much more apparent is the way in which food and nutrition play an important part in inequalities in health. So actually, many of the outcomes, health outcomes, are much worse in people who are poorer. Whether that poverty is defined by not having enough material goods, not having enough income, not owning land, not owning a boat if you're a fisher person, not having large flocks. Quite often in European countries, we don't have consistent measurements across different countries of income. It's quite hard to interpret those data. So people often use things like years in education, which is not a bad proxy for wealth and income. Interestingly, we don't very often look at food and nutrition by wealth. We tend to do it by immediate things like income. And that's what I want to go on to talk a bit about now, the relationship between food and nutrition and poverty. You might think this is very obvious. If you're poorer, you're not going to have as much money to buy nice food. Yeah, that's pretty true. Of course, it's a much more complicated story than that. And there are a couple of things I particularly want to draw out. One, the first, is the way in which nutrition in particular, nutritional components, have quite a history, about 100 years now, of being used to define poverty lines. Now you might think that's a very good strategy. Food's a basic need. If you were to work out a sort of least cost diet, what's the minimum amount of money you need to buy the most basic food you need to survive, surely that's a useful thing to know. Up to a point. It is a useful thing to know. The problem is how it's put into practice. And this has been a problem throughout the whole of the 20th century, and I see no signs of it changing in the 21st, unfortunately. And there's a lot of discussion in academic circles and in policy circles about how to define food poverty. It'd be nice if there was more opportunity for people who are living in food poverty to have a voice in that. But the kinds of definitions that are being used at the moment are food poverty is the inability to consume an adequate quality or sufficient quantity of food that's useful for health in socially acceptable ways, or the uncertainty that one will be able to do so. That links quite strongly to definitions of household food insecurity, and it is partly about dignity, about being able to behave like everybody else. A much more kind of economic approach is households who have to spend more than 10% of their income to obtain the food they need. There's also a more descriptive account of what food poverty is like, that it's a worse diet, worse access, worse health, higher percent of income on food, and less choice from a restricted range. That kind of sums it all up, really. So the important thing about these debates and the definitions, is that they give some quantification to how many people are living in these conditions, and one would hope point towards some of the drivers. Why are people falling into these conditions? To do with crises in income because of loss of job, or because of loss of social security, or long-term indebtedness, or some other problem that's hit a household. If you go back to nutritional standards and try and kind of turn nutritional standards into a diet, into a food pattern for different household sizes for a week, say, what you often end up with is something which doesn't look like a diet that anybody would want to eat. And probably, in its extreme version, it's a diet that even if you gave it to prisoners who had no choice, they would revolt. They would say, I'm not eating this same tedious stuff day after day after day. And that's because human beings are creatures of variety. Even the poorest societies, some of the places that I've worked and visited, places like Rwanda, or even parts of Mali, where some of the households I was visiting had very few of the world's goods. They were pretty poor people. They were very hospitable, very welcoming. To an outsider's eye, their diet looked very monotonous. But when they talked about it, you realised that although they didn't have very many different things, they made lots of different dishes with them. And what they looked for was variety from day to day, in the ways in which they prepared things, the spices they added, the vegetables, etc., etc. So variety is very important. So a least cost diet is quite hard to put variety in. But even if you do that, and there are some very heroic attempts to do that in a number of countries, what then do you use as the costs? Well, quite often, unsurprisingly, people tend to choose the cheapest versions of all the foods they can get hold of. That's a sensible thing to do if you're trying to find a kind of basic rock bottom minimum. That's maybe logical, but it isn't very practical, because quite often poorest people can't get to the shops or the markets that have those very poorest prices. Or if they can, the quality is not very good. And then the third problematic of doing this least cost diet is what proportion of income gets spent on food. And the people who are doing such calculations sometimes use national data sets in order to work out what proportion of income is spent on food, and then having calculated how much money you need to meet this basic diet, they sort of scale it up, which is all fine and dandy, but they don't very often look at what the poorest people spend on food. They often take an average or the bottom 20%, which is not the poorest people. So therefore they're using a percentage of income spent on food, which is often lower than the poorest people do. And the consequence of that is the scaling up gets it wrong and doesn't scale up far enough to enable people really to buy the things, not only food, but the other things they have to pay, like rent, like tax, like for fuel, if they pay for fuel, or water, if they pay for water. Increasing numbers do all over the world. So what you find in places where there are these kinds of minimum living standards, poverty lines, whatever they are, they actually misrepresent the realities for poorer people. And there are many other aspects of that misrepresentation that I haven't had time to go into. But the food ones I've just given you a glimmer for. And they often have very little in them to allow for even things like a birthday party or celebrating an important festival. Not only is the consequence that people are then blamed for not being able to budget and buy food and shop and cook properly, although very often they're extremely good at doing that, but they are also told, if you can't do this properly, then on your own head be it. So they're left responsible in both senses, culpability and having to do something about it. And this is such a familiar, depressing tale. In my own country, in the UK, it has a long history. If you look at the very basic costs of living, which got translated after the Second World War into the welfare benefits, you could show then, I can show you now, over 60 years, 70 years, that they are not enough for people to be able to eat healthily. But my voice is, and that of other people who do the same thing, is not heard, because the answer is this has been calculated scientifically and therefore it's okay. And it's not just in the UK where that happens too, it's pretty universal. The consequence is that people's food intake suffers even more, and there is a lot of evidence of this. Research I did some years ago, looking at what lone parents were eating in London. Time and again I came across people who were the most inventive and creative cooks, could sort of make a meal out of more or less nothing. There's certainly very little in their cupboards, but they could conjure up a meal. But because I was measuring their diets, I can tell, however creative and however hard they worked to protect themselves and their children from the consequences of not having enough money, their diet was woefully short on macronutrients. There was no way they had enough money to be able to meet healthy diet requirements. And so their health would continue to suffer. And there's a lot of evidence now, some recent work, for example, from the Institute of Development Studies and Oxfam, which has been done in a number of countries over the last couple of years as economic recession has really plagued many, many economies. Fall out of the bank crisis in 2007 and the collapse of the US subprime market. And that's had an incredible knock-on effect in many, many countries. And so this study that I'm just referring to from Oxfam and the Institute of Development Studies, they went and looked at how people managed as their incomes were falling. They were losing their jobs, public sector cuts, etc., stagnant wages, and of course rising food prices, which I'll mention again in a minute. How did they manage with all of that? Well, they cut back. They borrowed from their friends. They sent the children somewhere else to be fed. They dug into all their stores. They sold things. And time and again, they managed food by eking it out. Food is, if you like, what people can cut back on, because often you can't renegotiate your rent or your bills or your taxes. You don't have any choice about those. But you can, if necessary, live on a very basic diet for some time. So you stave off hunger or stave off starvation in the extremes, but actually you're really suffering. Your health is going down. You're more likely to be anemic. You're more likely to be extremely tired. You don't work well. Your children can't study. All of these consequences are difficult to capture in surveys. They're difficult to put a price on, either for the country as a whole, the economy as a whole, or for the individuals. They just know they feel pretty miserable. And that's the consequence of getting this measure wrong. It's a very severe one on individuals. Now, there is a lot of literature about rising inequality at the moment, globally and in a number of countries. And there is a lot of anxiety and a great deal of energetic work on inequalities in health through the Marmot Commission, WHO, and so on. Those two, of course, link together very strongly. But not many people are talking about rising inequalities in food access or food consumption. And yet in country after country, if you look at national surveys, you've always been able to see that poorer people eat less well. They have far fewer micronutrients, they have a much less diverse food base, and in some cases much lower calorie intakes. Although, as I say, when people have to cut back, what they do is try and avoid hunger, which tends to mean that people shop for calories. So the drive to sell food cheaply is a very powerful one and essential when you have all these low wages. And I don't have a magic answer to that, except that it's a condition which cannot continue indefinitely. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is that the food system itself, the food sector, is a major source of poor contracts, insecure livelihoods, low wages, lots of unskilled people. So many of the people who are being impoverished in the world by current forces actually work in the food sector, which seems a bit of an irony. And secondly, I think one of the critical issues is that few governments seem really to be grasping the food element of this inequality, even in richer countries. I might even say especially in richer countries. It's assumed that food aid is needed elsewhere. But what we're seeing now is in more and more countries, right across Europe, other parts of the world, people are turning to charitable food in order to be able to survive. And sometimes governments say, well, this is great. This is, this is very good social engagement. We like to see people helping their neighbours. Of course, I'd be the last to decry that. But it doesn't seem to me entirely just a moral way of going on that we say so many of our fellow citizens in country after country cannot make enough money to live on, or have been so hopelessly unemployed with no prospect of work, which seems to be the case for growing numbers of young people, that they have to rely on charitable handouts from their neighbours. This doesn't seem to be a good structure on which to build a 21st century society, for all sorts of reasons, not least that it's the experience, such as it is documented, is that it's quite demeaning for people to have to go and ask for help, ask for charity. And secondly, you don't have any choice about what you get. And whatever else we could say about the food system, it's premised on consumer choice. So this is the end of consumer choice. But more seriously, it isn't an answer. It isn't even adequate sticking plaster. It's certainly not looking at the fundamental needs that there are. And there are countries like the United States of America and Canada, which have a long history of food banks and food pantries and food systems of help from concerned neighbours. And what we've seen then in parallel, this is very widely documented by academics and campaigners and others, is a rolling back of state responsibility. So whatever social protection was in place, part of the social welfare system, that has been diminished or been inadequate. That isn't entirely true in the United States. So the food stamp system, which has now become the Special Nutrition Action Programme, there's nutrition in there again, actually has been shown to do some good. It's not enough. There are inadequacies, but it's much more effective than pure charitable aid. That's quite a hard lesson for people to learn, because those who are volunteering, and it is mostly volunteering in the charitable food systems, work very hard to make sure people have enough. And they don't want to be told that this isn't solving the problem. They want to be told this is great. And so it is in some ways. I think what it demonstrates is how much people do care about their communities, and they also care very much that people should have enough to eat. And that seems to be such a fundamental human driver. I think we lose sight of that in state responsibilities at our peril. What is this about rising food prices, or why was it they went up? And there's a lot of literature about this and a lot of argument. And part of it is because of major droughts in Australia and the US and other key cereal producing areas. Those were kind of fairly kind of immediate effects. There is also these longer running things that I mentioned about loss of biodiversity, anxieties about the food system. Some people argue that it's because of rising demand for meat amongst growing middle classes in southern parts of the world, and meat increasingly is not grass-fed but cereal-fed. So you can see that connection. There'd been a big, same on cereals, but there'd been a big EU directive pushing towards using cereals for biofuels. And some argued that that also contributed to rising commodity prices. There's quite a lot of evidence that, if not the initial increase, but subsequent volatility has been sustained by commodity speculation on the hedge fund markets, linked to that collapse in subprime back in 2007. So these are all big picture stuff. Plus, of course, rising price of oil. That's always been a big driver of food costs. Whatever the reasons, those increases in food prices, and they have been extraordinarily dramatic over the last 6 years, I suppose now, maybe 7, they have had profound effects in many parts of the world. There are also positive things that are happening at the moment, some of them very widely supported by policy responses, and that is picking up some of the things that I've been alluding to in my talk, which is about local action. Again, sometimes voluntarily, volunteer-led, volunteer-driven, volunteer effort all the time. Not always, because even volunteers need to be able to eat. They need a livelihood, so we have to get that balance right. And a lot of local level activity is not volunteers, it is about local producers and processors coming together. And there are a number of parts of the world where those kinds of local activities are somehow enabled or being enabled to survive. And there is growing evidence that when people can come together in small-scale activities, often around food, having a bit of money, a short-term loan, through some kind of community loan system, to be able to have a small land animal, goats or chickens or something like that, or to be able to set up a particular sort of vegetable plot, or to do some cooking and be able to sell the produce, small enterprises of one kind and another. These are spreading in Europe, in North and South America, and in many other parts of the world as well. And where those things come together, what people find is that even those who previously had no connection into food other than just going to the shop and buying the stuff, bringing it home, or even ordering it online and just having it delivered, find themselves being reconnected with, as I was saying earlier, soils, biodiversity, the natural world, animals, and relishing variety. Now, nobody is suggesting that we're going to be that communities, that countries are going to be able to feed themselves and feed themselves healthily and nutritionally out of small local enterprises. Actually, there are some people who are arguing that, but the majority don't see it for that. What they see is, firstly, this supplements the basics, and this gets us away from a cheap food scenario where all cheap food is about is calories. This is about richness of diet, nutrition and health richness, and truthfulness, and transparency and openness and understanding and reconnection. It's also about tooling people up so that they are more resilient communities, so that they can withstand whatever the forces of impoverishment are that are coming their way. And I think those kinds of activities are very exciting. I've done research in them myself, and even just visiting, a small community-supported agriculture scheme in a slightly forgotten part of the country, and hearing people talk about why they give up time to come and help with the weeding, help with the harvesting, how much they care about the quality of the soil, or how much they care about the well-being of the animals that are in this community-supported agriculture, not only for themselves, not only for their current community, but also for the future community, for their children and their grandchildren, that they feel they've got something to hand on, a natural environment and a social environment, and as well as a good economic environment, which is local and which is transparent and in which they have some kind of say. A few years ago, the Food Ethics Council, which is a small charity of which I'm a member, had a very interesting process, an inquiry into food and fairness. And we had 14 members on a panel who represented quite a mixture of people who are involved in the food system. So there were a couple of academics like me, but there were also people who work in industry, who worked in actual large companies, but also representing across the retail consortium and the food industrial sector. We also had a couple of people from think tanks and quangos, such as the Gangmasters Licensing Authority in Chatham House. And we had people from campaigning organisations and a couple of producers. And it was a really interesting experience for those people to think about what fairness might look like in the food system. The focus, because of our funding, was the UK food system, but of course in the UK we eat the world, as you might say, so we were not just looking at UK issues at all. And we used a very explicit ethical framework, which quite interestingly emerged during the process. I wasn't primarily involved in the drafting of the final report, but it is framed around fair shares, which is about equality of outcomes. So you're looking at the distribution of well-being, the fact that poorer people have worse diets, worse nutrition. Fair play, which is about equality of opportunity, looking at the access to the means of bringing about those outcomes, that people are decently paid and have decent jobs. And fair say, which is about autonomy and voice. And we use that framing, fair shares, fair play, fair say, to look at food security, sustainability, and public health. Those are all the issues I've been talking about. It was a really interesting, challenging experience and quite a comprehensive report, fully referenced, available on the web, of course. And even though it was done a few years ago, the messages that are in it are still applicable today. Cheap food is no longer a reasonable, possible policy option. We need to put social justice at the heart of the food system. Poorer farmers need a voice, poorer producers need a voice, poorer consumers need a voice, and we need mechanisms to enable that to happen. And we need food to be produced, processed, distributed, purchased in a system which is sustainable economically, socially, and environmentally, and which above all is just. Those are the things that drive me, and I hope those are the things that can drive you in the future.